Good afternoon. When I started thinking about this session, and I looked at the title, Motivations, Emotions, Decisions, at least the first two parts, I imagined that ghost of an economist in my head saying, "What's this soft stuff?" Well, I'll take you on a little tour of my own history. When I was a graduate student, my dissertation advisor was a man named Alan Blinder, and he was working on a book, the title of which became Hard Heads and Soft Hearts. Well, a little bit later in my life, I started wondering if economists had hard hearts and soft heads, and maybe that's why I ended up here at INET. But in between those 2 points, the formation of INET and my time working with Alan Blinder, I happened to walk into a place called Soros Fund Management. And I often wondered when I worked for George why Steve Jobs and Apple didn't have one of those Think Different posters with his picture on it. We both, we all had, within Soros Fund Management, this was the late 80s, had read The Alchemy of Finance, and there was a whole lot of discussion about indeterminacy, reflexivity, fallibility, which continues on and is very much in the fabric of INET today. And this session, which brings together something that I think is very important for INET, is a multidisciplinary team, is really inspired by George's thinking and articulation about the notion of reflexivity. For myself, running this organization and trying to, evolve the economics profession, it reminds me of another dimension of my life, which is that of being a sailor. There's always a certain anxiety when you let go of the mooring lines and you head offshore. You don't know what the weather's going to produce. You don't know what kind of things are going to cross your path. And you basically are dealing with fallibility, with what economists call radical uncertainty. And there's a tendency, particularly when the winds are high, when you're offshore, not to want to stay on deck. But at some level, you do yourself more harm if you go down and tie yourself into a bunk than if you stay and try to cope. And to me, the financial markets and the thinking that George has articulated about reflexivity, more than anything else, remind me of my life as an offshore sailor. So as is my custom, I brought you a song as we let go of the mooring lines today, as INET heads out to sea with this new multidisciplinary adventure. And the name of the song is by a group called the Waterboys, and it's called This Is the Sea. These things you keep, you'd better throw them away. You want to turn your back on your soulless days. Once you were tethered, but now you were free. Once you were tethered, and now you were free. That was the river. This is the sea. So, as we say, bon voyage. We have a combination of scholars here, in addition to Mr. Soros, Tanya Singer from the Max Planck Institute, a neuroscientist, and somebody who's just a heck of a lot of fun to be on panels with that Dennis Snauer taught me at the GES about 3-4 years ago, I think. David Tuckett, you were the other guy on that panel, I remember. Dennis Snauer, the director of the Kiel Institute, and Antonio Damasio, who's not only a famous professor of neuroscience at USC, but he happens to be the individual whose book has been most frequently referred to me through the course of my adult life by George Soros. His book, Descartes' Error, was something we've talked about many, many times and referred to over and over. So as we talk about their work particularly work that Tanya and, and Dennis have done, and talk then prospectively about work that, well, Antonio, you've been with us before in Berlin and also has talked with me and with others quite a bit about this thing called economics and how that appears to a neuroscientist. And so we'll explore everyone's perspective and then perhaps foreshadow some of the work that this research program, this working group, is just about to embark on. And like I said, that we are pushing offshore from traditional economics in a way that I hope will become both a beacon for us all and shed new light on the way in which economic decisions are modeled and made and understood. But at the outset, I'd like to invite George, who urged me on and urged this group on to express or share with us your vision and how this relates to your thinking.
Well, I think it's quite right that when you introduced the scientists, you did not include me, because I'm not a scientist. I guess I'm more a philosopher of social science. And so I'm not appropriate, I'm not a member of the panel. I'm also here to give a little bit of introduction, because the title of the session is very nondescript. It's so broad that it doesn't really say anything. And the subject that interests me is actually the role of identity, or the connection between identity and human uncertainty. Because in my conceptual framework, which has imperfect understanding, reflexivity, and the human uncertainty principle, you know, in explaining it, that concept, I followed the path by which I discovered it, and it's a fairly tortuous path. You know, it's really started with Hegel and his dialectic of ideas, and which Marx turned on its head and called it dialectical materialism, and I got particularly interested in the dialectics between the ideas and the material, hard reality, the material infrastructure. And that's a very complicated way to get there. Now that we have got there, I'm looking for the simplest source of uncertainty, human uncertainty. And that, I think, is to be found in identity, which relates both to individual identity and the identity of social organizations, which is a source of great uncertainty, because it's not something fixed. It can change depending on the role and the context in which it applies. And recently, I used to distinguish between the human uncertainty principle and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And recently, I discovered an affinity between those two sources of uncertainty, because subatomic phenomena can be seen either as particles or as waves. And strangely enough, human identity can also manifest itself as particles and as waves. And I was particularly struck when I was following events in Ukraine and the resistance in Maidan. And there you had people who were definitely particles, because they were, particularly the leadership, were actually university lecturers, university students, or people with university degrees. So very much people who were conscious of their individual identity. And yet, when they were in Maidan, they behaved as part of a wave, because they were part of a group of people who were resisting, or they were fired by the same cause, which they took as more important than their individual identity, and actually subordinated their individual identity to that group identity, and behaved as part of a wave. And they were actually willing to risk their individual survival for a cause which they considered more important than they. And they were still the same people, so it wasn't, as if they had changed, but their behavior changed. And actually, probably, not just probably, but definitely, the experience changed them and their concept of themselves. So their sense of identity is different now than it was before they had that experience. So that's a reflexive kind of two-way interaction. And I'm fascinated by that, because it shows you how unpredictable human behavior is. And that's totally contrary to the framework that has been developed and has been has actually monopolized economic theory. And I think that is the source of where it went wrong. This is the root of misunderstanding, and that goes very deep into, as I say, human identity, and then, of course, not only individual identity, but the identity of associations and groups that people identify with. So that's my interest, and it's, as I say, it's a philosophical interest, and I wonder how it can be studied scientifically. So that's why I was eager to participate and to follow your approach, because I think this is a field that is opening up. It was, let's say, covered up by the prevailing dogma, because it didn't fit the dogma. So now that that dogma is, I think, pretty decisively broken, this field opens up. And it, of course, it does take you quite far away from economics by itself, because it's by its nature interdisciplinary. And it's really the opening up of different people with different approaches, different disciplines, illuminating the same phenomenon that gives us the new insight, which will, I think, enable us to understand reality better. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
You know, sometimes when you're a young sailor and you push off from the dock, you know. Captain says, "Are you ready to go?" "Yes." Then when the captain says to you, "Yeah, we're going," you kind of wish you were back in the dock. Well, I don't know what I feel right now, but I think the captain just said, we're going sailing. Our next speaker is Antonio Damasio.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and wonderful panel. Thank you for your introduction. So I decided to do away with slides, and I wrote a lot of notes, which I'm going to try to follow, and tell you a little bit about what I do and what I would like to see happen in our field in general that I think is relevant for economic theory and economic practice as well. So we know that INET is obviously interested in incorporating new facts about human nature, and that makes perfect sense because economics is certainly about human nature. In fact, I always find it a little bit extraordinary if I read something about economics that doesn't refer to human beings per se, and doesn't refer to this very central issue, which is the fact that we are alive, there is life within us, and that the most important thing that we have to do all day long and all night long as well is maintain that life. It's really an issue of life maintenance and an issue of how that life is going to integrate with other lives psychologically, socially, and culturally. So what I will tell you has a lot to do with my work and the work of my colleagues at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. My colleagues are not here to speak for themselves, except for Hannah Damasio, my wife, who is also a neuroscientist. And let me tell you that what we are interested in is in an integration, a coming together of a variety of fields that have very strange-sounding names, but that in fact become one field at the end of the day. So I'll just enumerate some of them. Anthropology, evolutionary biology, neurobiology, cognitive science. You all know, even if you're not specialists of this area, of these areas, what they refer to. Something that is happening that is extremely interesting is that these fields are merging together because so much of the knowledge that is obtained in one of them has a bearing on the others. So in fact, today, to say something interesting about human behavior from the perspective of neurobiology or cognitive science requires that you know something about the history of humans before that, and that comes to anthropology, and something, for example, about the way evolution has brought us to where we are, and that requires some notions about evolutionary biology, even evolutionary psychology, and so you need this merging of fields. The topics that I would like to touch on, and I'm going to enumerate them and then make comments about each of them. The first one has to do with regulation of life. The term for that is homeostasis. It's a rather not well-sounding name. If you want to refer to it as life regulation is fine, but the technical term is homeostasis. A second topic I will touch on is cultural values. And in fact, when George referred to identity, individual identity and social and cultural identity, it's something you cannot talk about without referring to both homeostasis and cultural values. And the third topic that I would like to touch on actually has to do with something that George Soros has argued and defended very well, that has to do with notions of infallibility, notions of reflexivity, and in essence, notions of uncertainty. And probably the main message off the bat, and we will come back to it at the end of my comments, is that you really, once you deal with life truly, as opposed to some kind of desiccated mathematical representation of life, you are dealing necessarily with uncertainty. And the problem is that very often this is not seen, and that too much certainty, too much guarantee is vested on that conception which has been desiccated, but we are not desiccated. We are alive, and we have to take care of that life. So let me go to the issue of homeostasis. So the notion of homeostasis in very strict classical sense refers to the ability to regulate automatically our life, and our life not only at the level of an organism, but at the level of the components of that organism. The lowest point that you can go to is the level of a cell. Doesn't need to be a human cell, simply needs to be a living cell, and there's life regulation going on inside the cell, and it simply has to do with this. Think about the analogies with an economic system. It has to do with procuring energy sources, incorporating those energy sources in the body of the cell, changing them such that energy can be producing, excreting what is not important, and achieving something very important, which is the substitution of the elements within that cell that need to be maintained, without which life will fall apart and will, in fact, result in disease or death of that cell. So in order to maintain life, you need to have this complicated process of homeostasis, which in the case of an individual cell or a tissue or an organ or even a complex organism does not need to have necessarily any interference from us as individual thinking individuals. It can occur automatically. And in fact, when by the way, the notion of homeostasis, not the name, the notion was developed right here in France and right here in Paris, actually, by a physiologist with the name Claude Bernard. And Claude Bernard recognized the fact that there was this internal milieu to every living cell and to every living organism, and that internal milieu needed to be maintained, the milieu intérieur. And later on, in the 20th century, someone by the name of Walter Cannon actually coined the term homeostasis to describe the process as a whole that led to that interesting automated life regulation. Let me call attention immediately to something that the term homeostasis, the root is homeo, which refers to similar or comparable, as opposed to homo, that would refer to same. And this points to something very odd. When people try to explain homeostasis and life regulation in general, they very often use the analogy of the thermostat. So here's a thermostat that you set for 72 degrees, and when it gets to 72 degrees, it did its job, it quits. Regulation has been obtained. Well, the homeo root in the term, as Claude Bernard and Cannon thought about it, actually referred to the fact that rather than a set point, most living systems actually have ranges where the adaptation can occur. So you don't have the 72 degrees, except for very, very few parameters of your internal metabolism. You have a range within which things can operate. So, for example, our temperature doesn't need to be 37 degrees centigrade. It can be a little bit less, a little bit more. And there are ways in which that temperature can change for regulatory purposes. For example, to generate a fever that can control an infection, for example, or generate hyperthermia if you're cold and you need to maintain temperature. So all of those regulations have to do with ranges, and seeing these things in terms of a set point is one problem. And that immediately takes you away from that rigidity, and I will come back to the end to say that this is one of the reasons why regulation of life cannot be modeled as a rigid phenomenon and will imply some kind of unpredictability and, in fact, involve something like George's reflexivity. Now, the other great problem, and this is the central one, with the classical notions of life regulation is that when it comes to complex individuals, and certainly let's just be very candid and talk about humans only, although I think this applies to many other species. When it comes to humans, you have really two ways of regulating life. One is automated, is entirely non-conscious, it's implicit. There's something in the regulation, for example, the way you regulate blood sugar or the way you regulate hydration, the amount of water that you have. By the way, we have all day from breakfast to lunch, coping with the changes in temperature because spring finally came to Paris and the temperature is going up. We're doing all of these things, and a lot of these regulations are done automatically, implicitly. You have nothing to say about it, and you couldn't care less. However, there's a very interesting part of the regulation where we intervene as individuals with our decisions, and guess what? That comes out of the possibility of feeling. It doesn't come out of the possibility of emotion, doesn't come out of the possibility of drives or motivations in general. Although they act on it, it comes out of the fact that not only do we have a face of that regulatory interface that is related to, for example, metabolism, to chemistry, to the way cells operate, but you have this other face that turns to us mentally and that allows us to feel hunger, thirst, pain, pleasure, desire, well-being, malaise, and so forth. And we completely ignore this most of the time. And in fact, many textbooks that talk about this phenomena ignore the psychological, the experience, that psychological experience we have, and that does interfere with the regulation. Let me just give you a very simple example. When you are hungry, you will, of course, need to procure food. The reason why you're hungry is because there's one aspect of the regulation that produces that feeling at a certain point. When you eat, you actually do a correction on the lack that provoked that state of need. However, you may eat what you need, but you also may eat many things that you don't need. You may eat, for example, too much sugar. You may like sweets. And if you eat too much sugar and you do it chronically because you want to do it, because you have that feeling aspect to the regulation, you may end up having diabetes. You may end up getting insulin resistance, or you may end up turning part of what you consumed extra into lipids, and you may end up having obesity. So what is very interesting is that the same way that you have this extremely flexible regulation that gives you a range and that gives you this spectacular evolutionary development, which is feeling, that gives you a greater adaptability. It's, by the way, a great success story. Once Darwinian evolution tumbled onto feeling, creatures were on to a great success because the regulation was better, was more effective at the beginning, and it was compelling. And it also, you learned very well things that you were feeling. If you felt badly, if you had pain, you could stay away from the source of pain. And if something gave you pleasure, you could procure that source of pleasure. So that's all well and good, except that that very flexibility contains in itself the source of potential disease. And you can end up being sick. You can end up producing a variety, for example, obesity. What you eat, I'm just staying with the very simple example of food and drink. If you put too much salt in your food, you will end up, quite probably, if you don't control it well, with hypertension. That's, in fact, disease. And you may end up having as a reaction to that an inflammatory response, which by itself is also a natural regulation, but if it is too much of it, it becomes disease in itself. So what you see, and just try to imagine how interesting it will be to explore the relationships between governance of economic systems in terms of what you do, in terms of what you do with human behavior, market behavior, taxation, and what you can do in terms of inducing diseases or not, given what you prescribe for the patient, in this case, an economy. The last point I want to make on homeostasis is that as you have this interface that is so flexible and adaptable, what you're going to do is have an unpredictable, because there's no way of predicting if you're going to be very addicted and inclined to have sweets as opposed to something else. That response is not predictable directly, and it is going to produce an effect that produces in turn a reflex to that effect that is part of this cycle of reflexivity at a different level that George Soros talks about. Now, one of the reasons why this is so complicated is that the entire world of feeling is permeated by drives, motivations, emotions, moods, and it is also permeated by a variety of social related phenomena that have to do with the following. In-group, out-group relationships. There is a natural way in which in-groups and out-groups can be defined. There is a natural way in which our emotions can interfere with this process of feeling in the way our choices end up being governed. There is a way in which natural social emotions that begin biologically but are then captured by the culture and developed by the culture can develop such things as altruism, compassion, a sense of admiration and awe, a sense of moral indignation. All of these different aspects of drives, motivations, emotions are here with us. By the way, they're not exclusively human. They already appear in many other species before us, quite greatly in a variety of other non-human primates, but they're there and they permeate this world of feeling that is going to be the interface for our regulation. So any chance of the regulation being fully predictable is very low. What we do have is by knowing this, we have a possibility of intervening and in a way directing the choices that are being made, because we have the possibility of education. Obviously, if you are educated in the factors that contribute to the way you make decisions, you have the possibility of making those decisions more rational. So I want to make sure that you understand that I'm not against rationality, I'm not against logic, and I'm not suggesting that we follow our feelings and our emotions. What I'm suggesting is that we factor in those feelings and emotions so that we have a possibility of educating and understanding the systems with which we're working. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, we already heard George refer very interestingly to identity. Well, you have identities that are individual and you have identities that are cultural, but the interesting fact is that those identities are going to be made, are going to be achieved out of both personal and sociocultural factors that have to do with how you're put together and how the interactions with the culture occur. But once again, they're going to have a particular impact in such things as moral systems, belief systems, systems, for example, of justice, systems of education, because the education that you get is related to those varied cultural factors, governance in general, and of course, economics is part of this setup. So I think that any idea that you could conceive of economic systems without factoring in a variety of these elements of the puzzle, I think probably is not going to take us to very good port. I wanted to give you one very specific example that has to do with, because we're talking about values and cultural values, that has to do with so-called protected values. Protected values is one term in the scientific literature. Another term that is equivalent is sacred values, which does not have necessarily to do anything with religion. It has to do with it being sacred in the most pure sense of the term. And another way that is more general is non-negotiable, a non-negotiable value. And I just wanted to give you an idea that there are, in fact, and this again speaks to cultural values, to cultural construction and cultural ideas, there are values that, in fact, people will not trade anything for, those so-called non-negotiable values. So we have just at USC finished a preliminary study, and we're very, very interested in this, because we decided to take 3 entirely different populations, one of American-born, another of Iranian-born, and another of Chinese-born, and we gave them the opportunity of reading through narratives. By the way, narratives are one of the fundamental ways of transmitting cultural values. We depend on narratives for a lot of our cultural construction. So we gave them the opportunity of reading these narratives that had been culled out from hundreds of thousands of narratives that were available on the web. And the idea was to find out, well, first of all, incorporate within the narratives that appealed to a sacred value or non-negotiable value, and narratives that did not, and try to find out how people reacted to them psychologically, and how the brain reacted to the presence or absence of those non-negotiable values. And we are at the stage in which we have preliminary results, so I can tell you very briefly that something quite extraordinary happened. There are several networks in the human brain, especially at the level of the cerebral cortex, that work, our idea is that they work as search engines for the information with which you can put together a story and with which you can reason logically and intelligently over a problem. There's one particular network made up of a number of regions, and that network is distinguished functionally by getting very quiet when you are engaged in a task that has to do with the outside world. It's a very simplified way of describing it, but that's probably appropriate for this conversation. When you are thinking and you are in reverie, that network tends to be a little more active. Well, in the cases in which the narratives contained a clear non-negotiable value, an appeal to that non-negotiable value, this network was floridly active and was in fact responding, let's say, on all cylinders. And it was responding, we believe, because there was an issue of conflict that needed to be resolved. There was an issue of appeal to these different elements that needed to be resolved. So not only is there a different profile in the activation of this system, but it's telling you something very important, is that not all narratives are alike. Of course, we know that naturally, but we don't use that very often, and we sort of assume that they are alike. Well, they're not. And narratives that have to do with these fundamental distinctions that are so important in the construction of one's personal and cultural identity, and therefore the construction of one group's identity, those were obviously the values, the traits that were pushing the activity of this system. I'm not a great fan of using images from the brain, which are part of our bread and butter in our work, of using them to make points. But in this case, I will use it to make the point that this allows you to make this distinction and to recognize the importance of these factors just by looking at the brain and realizing that the brain has a special signature for this particular event. So I would like to close by once again saying that it would be extremely interesting to go through an exploration of some of these concepts. They're interesting certainly within the world of neurobiology and within the broad world of understanding us as human beings, but then think about how they have a way of being connected downward and backward in relation to our chemical, neural, and genetic base, and how all of that can push us in the past history throughout an anthropological evolution and in fact an evolution of our culture and civilizations, and of course how that is important going forward. There's one other thing in case I don't think there's anyone in this room that would claim that things that have to do with cultural identity or life regulation would be neutral or of no interest for what we're discussing in terms of economics. But let me just point this out. If you have something extremely important going on in the culture, something that defines the culture of a group and that allows that group to behave in a certain way, for example, behave in a more nurturing way in relation to families, in relation to children, in relation to education, or not. That by itself, which appears sort of surface, appears sort of behavior and society related only. There's no only, because that kind of behavior will have reflexes that will occur within the organism of each individual and therefore within the organisms of the individuals that are part of the group. And that reflex can appear, for example, at the level of stress. Now, guess what? Stress will be a very important cause of disease and will be a very important cause of derailment of the process of life. Not only that, that stress can pull all the way down into the level of genes, because what we are is in part, of course, what genes allow us to be, but not only. What we are, once our genes allowed us to have the structure we have, can be modified because behavior, for example, stress in a mother, can have effects on the genetic material of that mother and can have effects that are of such a level that will lead to changes. This is called, by the way, epigenetics. In other words, the world was complicated already with the genome and a good number of genes, but it's more complicated now because we know that it's not just about copying genes in the process of evolution and in the process of our generation. It's also about the influences that the way in which those genes can be affected in each of us and the way those changes can be passed on to other generations. So the story goes beyond complicated. It's really massively complicated. But just to call attention to the fact that all of this matters, and I don't know how one would think about governance in general or education or about economics without at some point appealing to these notions and seeing exploring the field and seeing to which degree is this important or not. Because there are many of these things that may not be relevant, but some will. So that's extremely important. And so I think that when you take this view of biology, I think George's notions of infallibility and of deficient predictability are entirely supported. In fact, one cannot imagine how that would not be. And I think that we have a chance of pushing reflexivity way down to the level of, in fact, non-conscious systems which have implicit operations as opposed to just entirely formal conscious operations. So I will stop right here. Many thanks.
Thank you. Next is Tanya Singer.
So I have a PowerPoint presentation. So let's see whether that works. What I wanted to present is a little bit, how can you imagine basically a neuroscientist and psychologist on the right, which is me, working with Dennis Snower, who is a macroeconomist on the other side, and bridging the micro to the macro. And we heard already that we need to do that, but it's probably a challenge of more than one decade or two, but let's just jump into this. So what the project, the INET project we engaged in, I think 2.5 years ago, we started, or 3 years, is basically called From Homo economicus Towards a Caring Economy, and how biology and psychology can inform actually economic decision making. And so the origin of it is that we are both actually concerned with cooperation and problems of cooperation and the global problems we are facing, like financial crisis. I mean, you know all about it. That's your domain. Climate change, you know, common good problems basically. But on a psychological level, we face other problems. We face problems like increasing stress diseases, burnout, depression, work depression, isolation, increasing narcissism, things which, you know, can also have big cooperation problem. So, we kind of realize, I think, everyone, independent on which discipline we are working, that the models we were relying on are not valid anymore, not enough, not sufficient to actually solve these global problems. So what we said is, let's move to a new model, a new narrative of human nature. Let's get rid of the kind of neoclassicistic model of Homo economicus and see how we can replace that with something which is more rooted in psychology, more rooted in biology, as we heard from Antonio, rooted more in evolution and what we really are, human beings. And so we also relate that to behavioral microeconomics. And so that's a very, you know, excuse me if in 15 minutes it can only be sketchy and I can't go really in the detail, but that is, I think, a sketch of how traditional economic models would have viewed human interaction there. To people, they cooperate, they have to do financial choices, and then you have these two variables, you have these preferences. You know, I had to learn what that is as a psychologist. They are kind of, funny enough, they come from nowhere, they are fixed in your body, they are context independent, and then they are stable over time, and you can only measure them if you see choices, so revealed preferences. So that's, for psychologists, Antonio is already laughing, this is it's like, wow. And then you have these beliefs about the other, and so you can only know about the other if you really see either the choices or you have these funny beliefs you kind of rationally read in a book, or I don't know, someone told you. So then, you know, you have Homo economicus, which has a rationality assumption and also, like, is mostly self-interested, even though, you know, newer economic models obviously also have social preference in their model. So now, let me tell very, very quickly how social neuroscience and neuroscience is looking at the world. And obviously, you know, it's a complex field as well. But we, for example, if we want to explain prosocial behavior, which you see at the very end of our prediction chain, we measure, either as psychologists or neuroscientists, what is going on motivational and also theoretically in our brains beforehand. And we know all these phenomena like emotion contagion, empathy, compassion, which are very strong motivator for cooperation and behavior. And on a more cognitive side, we know this kind of pathway or the cognitive route, which is called mentalizing or cognitive perspective taking or theory of mind. It's all the same words. What it means is basically that you can understand the intention of another person, the belief system of another person, and by that understand that the world of another person, the mental world, is another one than yours. So theory of mind, or this cognitive route, is very, very important for example, cross-cultural understanding of cultures which are different, of outgroup members. The red route, empathy, emotion, contagion, compassion, is very important on an affective level, and Antonio has talked about that. This is like we feel the other, we can share feelings with the other knowing what they do. So let me give you just one very little example of emotion contagion we have done in our lab. We just published that. It's Veronika Enger's work, who is a stress specialist, and what we did is actually you can measure cortisol response. So the cortisol response is the end product of an HPH stress response. When you are giving a talk in front of an audience like you see it on the picture, and this audience, instead of you being so interested in looking, would always be like, you know, and they have these white shirts. So you really get stressed because you get only negative social cues, and you have to give a job talk, and you think you are the last person on this earth. You know, why do they not react at all? So this is for sure rising the cortisol response in your body, and we can measure that through saliva. Now you see perhaps behind the one-way mirror there is a person, and this person is passively observing the other one getting stressed. So it's a bit like, you know, your boss is getting stressed at your workspace and you're just sitting next there doing your thing. And now we are measuring whether the person passively observing the other is actually also having a stress response. Even though the person is not stressed, it's just passively, vicariously in the room. Here, not even in the room. And in fact, we get a response. This is just one example of multiple examples we have in social neuroscience on how we contage each other. And in terms of the model, you know, I showed you, here. This means, you know, the preferences I will talk about, we don't call it preference, we call it motivation or goals. But they are linked. They are linked through unconscious password. Every second we speak, we are processing the intention, emotion, feelings of others, whether we want it or not. So we don't have to wait to see financial choices, and actually your stress will change my preferences. So your preferences in your terms could change my preferences through automatic unconscious mechanism, because my choices will be different when I'm stressed than when I'm not stressed. And the reason why my preferences change it at the moment were the other person, I'm not even aware of it. You know, like, for example, in the crisis, when or like after, you know, airplane kind of goes down, then the 11th of September and so on. I mean, all this are kind of irrational responses because of stress contagion, emotional contagion, and so on. So you have to understand that to basically say, you know, this model is. The other thing is preferences. We don't call them preferences, and we also don't assume that we have a fixed one, but we would rather call it motives or motivational system. And there are many of them, and animals have them, and human beings have them, and I just list you 7, just to see how complex actually human nature is. So you can be motivated by achievement, you know, just goals. You can be motivated by resource seeking, consumption. You can be motivated by power and status, and they are all different motivation systems. You can have an activation of your threat system, and so that can either express an anger or fear. It's when you are threatened, your system is threatened. And then you also have affiliation and care. These are very strong motives you find in rats, in animal species, and in humans, obviously. And the important thing, the difference between affiliation and care is what George Soros and Antonio alluded, is our in-group, out-group distinction. So it's like affiliation, we want to belong to a group, we want to have an identity of an in-group so that we can say this is the out-group and this is me belonging to another group. And that's very rudimentarily ingrained in our biology. Care is something which without care system, we would not have offspring. We wouldn't be there. It's very, very fundamental, but economy has completely neglected it. Then now comes in reflexivity. So if we replace preference motivation, it's not all. Which motivational system will be activated at a certain time depends on the context. And it depends not only on the context, it depends on how we interpret the context. So let me give you an example of our lab. Imagine I'm doing empathy research, you know, sometimes. So people are lying in the brain scanner getting pain. And next to the brain scanner, other people getting pain too, but I don't feel them. I can measure the pain matrix, the network in the brain, which is activated when I know that Dennis is getting pain, but I don't feel anything. And what we can see is that we have a response in a network which is also engaged in my negative reaction to my own pain. So you could say I'm feeling neurologically the pain of Dennis. Now, imagine, now I have 2 people, and the experimenter tells me I'm a football fan. And the experimenter tells me George is from my in-group, he is from the same football club, you know, same identity, we are an in-group. And Dennis is an out-group, he is, I don't know, in France, which, you know, you are like the out-group football club member. And it's only in my head now, you know, they are both nice people, but in my head now I think he's an in-group member, and he is an out-group member. Now I give pain to them and to me, and I measure my brain response. Depending on whether I think the in-group or the out-group member gets pain, I will measure motivational signal in my brain, very empathic for George, because George is my friend. I have these empathy-related, compassion-related signal, and I have Schadenfreude when I see Dennis getting pain. I'm rejoicing of him getting pain just because I think he belongs to my group or not. It's not even real. So that's an example of the power of beliefs and reflexivity in social situation, because this will determine whether in a later session, experimental session, I will help if George or Dennis are in pain, whether I will basically be cooperative. So to make a long story short, this is rather the model we would have to come up if we take into account all the things I told you. We have many different contexts, and they have to be appraised through our machinery, and depending on how I appraise the context in the other person, different motivational system will be activated, and depending on which motivational system is activated, you will have different decisions within the same person. So if consumption is activated, you will have self-interested behavior. If the care system is activated, if the care motivation is activated, you will have prosocial altruistic behavior. If affiliation is very strongly primed and activated, you will have norm-conforming, social group conforming. If power and status is activating, you get combative behavior as a tendency. If achievement, you get excelling. If the threat system is activated, you can have defensive or aggressive behavior. And so you see already one utility function becomes 7, depending on the context. So, of course, we are economists, we are psychologists, we want to change, we want to make this place a better world. So we are interested in what are the contextual change agents and factors which can actually move this motivational system up and down, so that instead of only activating consumption, we could also sometimes activate altruism, care, affiliation to have higher global cooperation levels. Okay, so this is where my department is very much engaged since years in what we call in neuroscience plasticity research. And plasticity research is really exactly the opposite of stable preferences. So for people who study plasticity, stable preference is like what? It's like very strange. Because this is really all about change. It's all about how you can actually change human nature. And we do these different studies with brain studies, but also behavioral. We measure hormones. We have usually a multidisciplinary approach. In a short-term intervention mental training study where we train preferences, social preferences, we train, social capacity, compassion. And we just finished a study where we did mental training over a year, 30 minutes in people who work like us. 30 minutes every day, like you go, instead of going to the fitness club, you go into a mental gymnasium. And then we measured 90 measures and see, can we change basically human nature even in adults? And then sometimes we have fun flying in Buddhist monks who are considered expert in altruism and compassion, and this is a joint work with the Dalai Lama. So we put them in the scanner, and then we can kind of understand in an expert who has done 40,000 hours of mental training of compassion how this should look like when we, if we would be a better person. This is just one very short example of how in naive people, in student, in university, we basically go about. And so one study basically does memory training, cognitive training, is a control condition. And then another learn these kind of compassionate, loving kindness, this feeling of concern, empathy. And then we measure them in the scanner while they're exposed to BBC video clips of news from the world, like suffering in the world. And usually what you see in your brain is an alarm system. The whole brain, when you are exposed to suffering, is kind of getting the threat system on. And then we ask them, how do you feel? Positive, negative, how much empathy, compassion do you feel for the people? And what we typically find, we have done these studies now repeatedly, is that a network in the brain, whether the expert or the naive people after a week, is activated, which actually comes with positive feeling of love, an increase of positive feeling of strength, concern, and love. And this is true even though these people are exposed to very much suffering and negative stimuli. So it is a kind of network where it allows you to cope with stress and with suffering of the world in a compassionate and caring way. And so this protects you also from stress-related disease and burnout. So we have done now a lot of studies, and what we see is that this kind of care system, if you activate the care system through mental exercises, emotional exercises, it comes with an increase in happiness, positive affectivity, but also in cooperation. So we have put 300 people through these economic games, trust games, dictator game, all this behavioral economic thing. And we can see that after 3 months or a week, you actually get more altruistic, you get more trusting, you get more cooperative. It's a good emotion regulation strategy, it's pain analgesic, and it reduces stress on the level of your hormones. So this is just to give you perhaps a summary of how we think about it. You have all these different motivational systems, and they have to be in a balance. They all evolve because evolutionary needed them. It's not that one is better or the other is worse. There is no normativity in that, really. It is all needed by evolution, but they need to be in balance so that the system is healthy. And I just showed you that actually compassion training, mental training can boost affiliation and care. So the question now is, how could we use these more psychological neuroscience level to come up with new macroeconomic models? And as you know, the economists love equations, and so this is where the Dennis comes in. So you remember we moved from basically this picture of Homo economicus to a rather more complex picture where you have 7 motivational systems which have, there's a multi-directionality of utility function, you could say, which will depend on the context you are in and the identity which is activated in you. And this will result in very different choices in behavior. And this is now, can you see this? This is putting equations into linking motivation to behavior, in putting utility function in between, which are a mathematical formulation of this psychological reality. And so what you can do now is to make very clear quantitative prediction in the lab, but also for macroeconomic models about what behavior or level of cooperation you can see depending on which system is mostly activated. And obviously this is a starting point. It's very complex because it's a multi-directionality. It's not just one utility function, you plug in some kind of constants, and then you have like 7 now, and depending on the context, they will be activated differentially. So the important thing now is to make research on change agent, and as you know, this is the domain of economics and politics. So you have this one nudging unit after the other kind of emerging in UK, in Germany now. Angela Merkel has also put in a little nudging unit now. So nudging is like changing the context so that your decisions are nudged through the context. But I showed you what psychologists can do and what we can all do actually if we decide to do it right now, because we all have our own minds with us. We don't need to wait for politics to come. So we can do mental training, and we can introduce this kind of mental and secular ethical training into schools. Mental gymnasium. Instead of just learning knowledge, you can learn how to regulate your emotion, you can learn how to become, more compassionate, how to understand better other people, how to develop your theory of mind. And you can do that, and this will also bring change into the system. So you don't have to wait only until laws change in terms of politics. So this is just the little INET group here on the right, which allowed, and thank you for the INET people to allow us this kind of first steps into this direction. And that's my group in And so, because Antonio said we are basically in neuroscience an interdisciplinary endeavor, so it's really interdisciplinary. I'm working with economists, sociologists, philosophers, politicians, biologists, medical doctor, neuroscientists, and we all have to work together to actually find some way to get at a more realistic, picture of human nature. So thank you for your attention.
Well, now that we're all confused, I think what we have to do is turn to an economist to regain a sense of certainty. I was just kind of bewildered by my associations. I'm listening, you talk about the plasticity of preferences and bringing in Buddhist monks, and I've never thought of a Buddhist monk as a plastic surgeon before. But there's a richness, there's a texture, there's a sensibility that at very least is breaking open the mold that economists have used. Dennis, how does this feel to you? How you're working with Tanya, you're starting to work with Antonio. Where do you see this heading?
I was brought up with the belief that economics is independent of other sciences that study our social nature and human nature in general, because basically everything that we do can be described in terms of the maximization of utility functions, which is what basically underlies all of mainstream economics. And that defense has been made very strongly throughout the ages in economics. And if one challenges that, then one must be willing to make one's past thinking and past work obsolete. And I've reached the conclusion in particularly now, my interactions with Tanya, that our thinking needs to be made obsolete. Because what underlies our conception of preferences in economics, which is the basis of our utility maximization, which is the basis of our explanation of all economic activity, is demonstrably false. We believe that preferences are unique. Tanya has just showed our research indicates that we have multiple discrete motivation systems that drive us in different directions. So we are multi-directed. Preferences are not unique. As economists, we believe that preferences are located in the individual. Tanya has just told us that preferences are not context independent. They're the outcome or our motivations are the outcome of the interplay between us and our environment. So they are not located in the individual. They are located partly in our social setting, partly in our internal milieu, partly in our external environment. In order for preferences to play their role in economics, they must be temporally stable for at least sufficiently long for us to do our revealed preference experiments. But motivations can change just like that. If you're hit by a threatening stimulus, boom, the threat system goes up. This doesn't mean that we're irrational or unpredictable. It's perfectly predictable given what our environment is telling us. We are told as economists that our preferences must be internally consistent, otherwise we're irrational. But different motivation systems are not consistent with one another, and we're able to adopt different motivations at different times. in economics, preferences are basically exogenously given, except for basic research in habits and so on, where they change very slowly. Or in behavioral economics, where it depends on the status quo point and so forth. This research indicates that they are endogenous in very, very exciting ways. And this is where I would like to go back to what George said at the outset. About reflexivity and uncertainty and identity being intimately connected with one another, and what Antonio said about life. In economics, we believe that our knowledge of our external environment is determinate and can be objectively observed. Now, this I too have come to believe in my interaction with Tanya and others, is demonstrably false. We create our own perceptions of our environment, our own concepts, and in the process of interacting with our environment. And our perceptions and our concepts are things that enable us to navigate our environment in such a way as to preserve life. And consequently, there is no determinate knowledge. We are co-creators of the reality that we see in us. And that means that our lives are not replicable experiments. As soon as we repeat something that we've done before, it's something different because we remember that we've repeated it. It has different associations. And if we repeat it long enough, it gets boring. And that too is something different from what we had before. And if an experiment is non-replicable, then all our probability theory and our statistics can be thrown out of the window, and we are dealing with radical uncertainty. And since we co-create our environment, there is a reflexive process between our environment and our manipulation of our environment that gives us our sense of identity, but introduces a sense of uncertainty into the environment, because uncertainty, radical uncertainty, arises through non-replicable experiments. And therefore, uncertainty is basically the thing that we deal with most of the time, virtually all of the time. And the risk and probability and so on, that is something that we get through economic experiments, so when we roll a dice, so when we go into a casino and so on. Very artificial human constructs can generate that. And so the human organism deals well with uncertainty. We have various ways of dealing with uncertainty. We open our eyes, our senses are alive when we are afraid of something, an uncertain threat. But our economic analysis has not caught up with that at all. And so there is a lot of work to be done here in reconstructing economics, in simply to adopt the insights of human nature that other disciplines take for granted. And they have studied human nature much more deeply than economists have. And those insights happen to be relevant for economic decision-making, because preferences, whether preferences are located in the individual or the outcome of our interplay with the environment, whether they're stable and internally consistent or context independent, that makes a big difference to our economic decision making. And starting to build models that enable us to embody an understanding of a more mature understanding of human nature is certainly the most exciting thing that I've been involved in my career, even though it will make all my past work obsolete.
Antonio, is there any homeostatic explanation about why economists are so resistant to change?
I guess not. No, I doubt very much that economists are that resistive to change. I don't see it. Whenever I talk to economists individually, they're most agreeable individuals, and they're intelligent, and they can, oh, look, they're being illuminated. So I think it's really a matter of making the case. What I find very exciting about all this is the exploration of this area, and an exploration that we can have together. So it's not that neurobiologists have all the answers, but there's things that we are studying that are interesting, and I find what I'm very seduced by is what appears to me as analogies, things that I can see transferred across the disciplines. And when you reach the stage in which you can sense those analogies, it's a time to explore them. It may mean that some of them will not pan out, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be tried. But and overall, you could have called this session uncertainty or controlled uncertainty. Because it's the theme here. What we want to stay away from is this notion that everything is fixed, that we are fixed by genes, or we are fixed by a brain structure that sort of settles when we are adolescents or young adults. This is just demonstrably false. And in fact, we're changing all the time. And I have a good news for those of us in the room that are older, is that you continue making new cells, including new nerve cells, in your brain, provided you give your brain some use, some practical, good, positive use, and provided you actually have positive effect. So, in fact, some people may laugh, well, stories of Dalai Lama, this is a little bit too much. But there is a very strong reality behind it. So much, I have been convinced by this, for example, at our institute at USC, which is called the Brain Creativity Institute, we have done two things. One is that and this is part of the effort that you heard about. Neuroscience has been doing quite a lot of work in general understanding of the brain, and we've been very successful. Has been done quite a lot of work in applications of that understanding to medicine. There's no question that neurology and psychiatry have made progress, and that's all well and good. But there's something novel about neuroscience, basic neuroscience, which is applying those methods and the knowledge we now have to what I call the social space. That's what we've been talking about. So, I'm firmly convinced that the inventions of culture, which are only possible because we have a life to preserve, we have the mandate to preserve and govern life as well as we can, because we have intellect, and because we have this remarkable coding ability called language, we have the possibility of inventing things. We have the possibility of inventing instruments, whether they are the arts or the instruments of governance or technology or science, beginning with medicine. We have been inventing them since we are humans in the proper sense of the term. And those inventions change the picture and change the biological picture in many ways, because not only they dynamically change the brain, but they actually also allow you to change the conditions of our own biology. It's very important to nurture that. And I mentioned education. I was glad to hear that Tanya mentioned it as well. It's one of the instruments through which we can act. Of course, we can act politically, we can act in the general culture, but education is one way of instituting or shepherding the changes that we want to see happen in a better world. Because in the end, it's all about life. And if you go back to Greek philosophy of the 500 years before Christ, what we have in the philosophy of the axial age cultures is this desire to understand, to question and understand what is the good life and ways of creating that good life. Well, that good life is not fixed. That good life is a very dynamic process. But we can have an intervention in it, and we can bring neuroscience in that direction. And just one last word. I'm so convinced that you can do these good things that I even relented, and we have allowed a Wednesday noon practice of meditation in our institute. We have never done any study like the one that Tanya referred to, but we have one of the people in the group is a very experienced meditator, and he came to us and he said, wouldn't it be nice to have a session on that? And it's fine, you know, as long as I don't need to meditate, fine, go ahead. And that's happening now. Thank you.
Perhaps just a story to add, you know, when I started working with these monkey business monks and Dalai Lama, I was also like, what's that? And, you know, but actually meditation, the word, you know, where people think this is a spooky, funny thing, is nothing else than cultivating your mind. It's just cultivating your mind. That is meaning meditation. So it's actually mental training. It's just like getting to know how you work inside. And when I actually also experienced when we started these secular mental training, it's not religious, it's secular. People thought a bit like, what, Max Planck Institute, all these cushion coming in, and you know. But then after a while, the waiting list of the students got bigger and bigger and bigger to go into the retreats, because they kind of figured out that that was actually something really useful to do and something really wholesome. And so now we have to organize these studies for the students instead of, you know, our guinea pigs. So I think once, you know, these prejudices fall down, people realize that this is actually, you know, we have all these gyms for our body, for our physical fitness, but in schools we don't have anything to teach our children how to regulate their emotions, how to understand other people, how to regulate positive affect instead of stress, how to, you know, watch the mind, how to get more attentive. We have ADHD all over, but we don't have any technique to actually teach them to keep attention on a spot. And mental training is nothing else than just teaching students these extremely important mental capacity. And I really hope that economy is starting understanding that, because this is a real practical implication you could do tomorrow. You could just implement it in schools, university, and it's easy. And you don't even need a machine, it's cheap, and you can do it. You can do it in every moment, you don't need anything. So that's a plaidoyer for more mental fitness and mental health.
A lot of things come to mind, but I'll confine myself just to one observation that might be helpful, and that is, how come that economics has excluded, banished all these studies that you have mentioned so far. And this was done, I think the final word was by my professor of economics, Lionel Robbins, in the 1930s, who wrote an essay on the scope and whatever else of economic theory, definition of what an economics is all about. And he said that economics is concerned with the interaction in the market between the given values and given capacities of or modes of production. In other words, studying of how values might change or methods of production might change is outside the scope of economics. Economics is only concerned with the application of limited means to unlimited ends through market exchange. So it's only interaction in the market. That's the only kind of change that is admissible for study by economics. And that excludes all of the stuff that you have talked about. Now, I have also a question, and that is, what brings the three of you together? I mean, you've been doing your work so far separately, but you now have a project that you're under consideration to work together. What do you see as the objective of that project? If you can just very briefly state it.
My take on it is the following. To my mind, this is new economic thinking because it is a new paradigm of understanding who we are and what we do. And it also has huge policy implications. Now, economists have been terribly influential. And the reason for their influence is that they have simple models that become bedrock in policymakers' minds and also implicit in the thinking of the general public. Now, our challenge is further to develop relatively simple models, but that are more in accord with our insights in human nature gained in other disciplines, thereby maintaining our influence, but using it to better effect and better ends. And hopefully, in the process, changing what the domain of economics is. What George Soros has just said, Lionel Robbins, his idea that economics is basically devoted to the study of the allocation and distribution of scarce resources, limited means to unlimited ends, that does not put the human being at the center of our analysis. If in the process of thinking about human nature engaged in economic decision-making, we come to redefine economics as perhaps the material basis of human well-being, then human beings would be much more inside the picture. We would not necessarily focus entirely on pecuniary material incentives, and we would be able to make decisions about how to guide economic behavior that gives us a much wider latitude than the straitjacket of pecuniary incentives has allowed us to, and allows us to think in areas where we have never dared to tread, like shaping identities and so forth. And so that, I believe, is what makes this type of cooperation important and necessary, but also very difficult because funding bodies, academic conferences, publication outlets are all still in their disciplinary silos. And so what to do when you have an insight that travels across the boundaries of these silos, that, I think, is the challenge that we are wrestling with.
Questions from the audience? We'll take three.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation. I'm Steve Clemens with The Atlantic in Washington, D.C. I'm impressed with the things, but I'm going to be the fly in the ointment here, I guess. I'm interested when we talk about human motivation or aspirations to do good, to be a better person, to be the good life, that somehow we're neglecting the bad life. We're neglecting the fact that evil people do things. That we used to have a fellow at the New America Foundation named Eric Liu, who wrote a book about how children learn, how they learn to become a race car driver, a school teacher, a politician or something. And I said, where's the Darth Vader chapter? Where's the chapter on becoming a drug lord or the chapter on being a killer? I was thinking when George mentioned the Heisenberg principle in the Maidan, what came to mind were the 47 US senators who signed the Iran letter. And so I'm always interested when we have something is whether or not when you think about models of human interaction or human aspiration, that we neglect the evil or dark side. And that undermines, or at least that's my impression, and that undermines the explanatory ability of what we do, because you'd be able to look at both sides of what motivated people in very different realms. And so, you know, mine is sort of the anti-yoga question.
A quick comment and a question. The panel gave a pretty devastating critique of Homo economicus, very, very powerful and complete. I would just briefly add to that critique. If one looks at the history of where the ideas of utility and preferences came from, starting with Jeremy Bentham, going to Bernoulli, up to Milton Friedman, Sargent, Lucas, it's all made up. There's no there. When you really look deeply into the history, this was originally started as a philosophical exercise because there was no cognitive science. There was no the kind of modern science of psychology that we have. So a charitable view would be economists were doing the best they could with what they had at the time, which were a set of philosophical ideas. But now we actually have real science, the kinds of things that you guys are doing. And so I think it's a major milestone in economics if we can replace a made-up story of utility and preferences with a truly scientifically grounded theory of human behavior. You know, one should look at the history of these ideas as well. Now, the question, though, is the reason why these ideas have hung on so long, despite growing scientific evidence, is because economists can put them in models. And so my question to you is, how are you going to put these ideas in models? Because until we do that, the economics profession is going to have a hard time accepting them.
Thank you very much. I'm Jesus Puente from the delegation of Mexico to the OECD. And well, it's been very interesting what you said. I have some comments regarding Mr. Dimacio's explanations. And with his explanations comes to mind the concept that I didn't hear explicitly, but it's embedded in all what that you said, which is the comment of cognitive dissonance. From what you said, I can kind of get the sense that the actual identities, society's identities can be possibly the result of cognitive dissonance from societies as a whole. And in this respect, how important do you think culture is? Culture derived from cognitive dissonance is for the promotion or restriction of scientific research and actual objective understanding of economics and science in the widest sense. And on the other hand, there's also this reality perception argument that we need to, where, well, science has evolved undertaking or assuming many things in order to undertake research and analysis. And in natural sciences, there is this, well, normal conditions are assumed in order to undertake analysis. However, there's also this argument of the so-called observed effect related to Heisenberg's uncertainty that also, well, adds to the problem of actual research. In this respect, and given this very wide arrangement, sense of different things that you take into account in order to undertake your research, what are reasonable limits to assumptions and what are not reasonable on the one hand, and where do we draw the line on what assumptions are reasonable? How far must we go in this undertaking of multidisciplinary analysis that you are doing so intelligently? Thank you.
Yeah, you can hear me. So I've been listening all day to a lot of very interesting talks and have been hearing a great deal that seems to have been focused around economists worrying about whether and to what extent economics is scientific or a science, and what I call cognitive authority they can claim within the wider realm, within the wider world, and very much concerned about being able to influence people with theories and models which they seem to agree have been largely false. And what I haven't really been hearing a lot about, and which I think you should be hearing a lot about at a scientific conference, are problems in economics. And I think that there are a lot of them that I think people really might want to ask, like, what is money in 2015? What is the relationship between wealth and inequality? How do we think how did the 2008 crisis happen? Why are there periodic crises? I mean, I hear people talking about how we're going to salvage economics as a science, and I'm hearing a lot of good ideas, and I think we need new economic thinking, but I'm not hearing a lot about problems. Maybe it's just that I've been attending the wrong talks. But I think that science has to be driven by problems and not by preconceptions about what it takes to be scientific. I mean, that was like the beginning of the 20th century, and it's largely a joke because people looked at Newton's mechanics and thought that, oh, how can we be so good? Just as we were finding out that maybe it wasn't as good as we thought. But they began trying to imitate what they mistakenly took to be the method of science. The method was one answer, but I think that that method's been, that answer has been exploded. What about new economic problems?
Very good. So they're all excellent questions. Let me start with the question of the dark side. I don't think that we certainly are not focusing on the positive side only. In fact, when I look back at the research that we have done on the neurobiology of human feeling and emotion, we started with the negative. We started, for example, with negative emotions, with wrong decisions caused in part by negative emotions or by the absence of emotions that could help positive intuitions. We started a lot with fear. In fact, it was the other way around. We started with the negatives. It's finally, as one gets older, that one becomes goody-goody and wants to go to the good side, the side of the angels. But we are doing all of it. It's just that my intuition here is that there's far more of positive than negative. If our world was in fact dominated by the dark side, and sometimes when you read the news in the morning, it looks like now it is, but it's not true. You know, we've been in cycles like this before. Sometimes I have the impression that we live through an undeclared First World War when you look at the number of conflicts that are going on in the world. But that's probably not real. It's an effect that comes from the way news are presented. And I still think that there's more positive than negative in human nature. And even if there's plenty that is negative, I think it wouldn't take us anywhere to start with the negative and to punish the negative or to try to eliminate it. I think the only way out is to understand it all and try to emphasize the good part. And then related to that, and I think to your last comment, which I find so interesting, as far as I'm concerned, I look at the possibility of interacting with economists as a possibility of having a case study that will help me understand aspects of cultures. What I'm really interested in is to understand how biological structures at some point, because of the way brains came to be structured and cognition and feeling were possible, how is it that cultures emerged? That's the thing that interests me. And that's the reason why I'm interested in studying music as well, because I think it was one of the first such developments, and it's a spectacular development of humans, and a great banner for human culture, and one that is certainly on the good side. Some exceptions made possibly for Wagner, but we don't worry about that. Now, what I think is so interesting when you think of things in terms of homeostasis is that, I mean, think of this in terms of millions of years of human history. We're not new. We are the result of very, very, very long evolution, way beyond anything that we can imagine. And when you think about that, even at the age of Homo sapiens, what we realize is that we are operating on a base of basic homeostasis that is extremely perfect. The way we regulate temperature or calcium concentration or sodium or glucose is actually very perfect. And as we evolved, we introduced a new layer of complexity, which is feeling, that actually brought that under a bit less control. But what it gave us in turn was the possibility of culture and the possibility of having a complete novelty, and that novelty is what we're living through. So the way I like to describe the situation is that as far as our basics of life regulation are concerned, we're pretty good, and we can do a good job. When it comes to regulation, to homeostasis, that is at the social and cultural level, we are at best a work in progress. So try to imagine what it would have been like for simpler life forms to cope with life regulation 500 million years ago. It was probably not as perfect as it is now. And so it may well be, if we want to be hopeful, it may well be that life regulation at the social and cultural level will actually, bit by bit, attain slightly better levels of equilibrium. If you read a philosopher like John Gray, he will laugh at you and he will just say that's baloney. We live in cycles and we're perpetually going to come back into crisis and forget about progress in an Enlightenment sense. I happen to think that that's too negative, and if I just believed that, I think I would dedicate myself to listening to music and going to the beach. I believe that there are better things that we can do, and economists have done lots of good things, so maybe we can all participate in this. Thank you very much.
About the dark side. Of course, if one is interested in motivation systems, you will get both the caring motives and also the negative dark ones. In-group, out-group generates cooperation and conflict. And that contrasts very strongly with traditional economic emphasis on self-interest, where you're basically only concerned with yourself. And the idea of enmity or care is something that's foreign. Where all this came from me is because of problems. And I'm sure we all come from that point of view. And as president of the Kiel Institute that is concerned with global problems, it struck me that in the process of globalization, we've created a lot of wealth and more material well-being and helped a lot of people escape out of extreme poverty. But at the same time, our global problems are also increasing. Financial crises, climate change, poverty in the midst of plenty, and so forth. Overfishing and deforestation and so forth are all need to be seen in a global context. And in order to deal with these problems, we need to cooperate across cultures and across national boundaries. And how do we do that? And the fact that cultural and national boundaries are an issue is something that economics is blind to. And This helps us see where these issues are and deal with them more effectively. And of course, the way we deal with them is by building models. And these models serve both economic purposes in the same way as standard economic models do, but there's also a hope that there may be a neurocomputational aspect to it as well that enables us to understand brains in the future. And it gives us a richer conception, and this is where culture comes in, of what human beings are. And they are going back to the point that George Soros made at the beginning about particles and waves is really important. That is, we see ourselves both as particles and as part of a social wave. And it is only by seeing us as both the embodiment of both of these things that we come to a better understanding of what human beings are. And this means questioning methodological individualism, seeing not only the micro foundations of macroeconomics as important, but the macro foundations of microeconomics. So social forces act on individual decisions is vitally important. And also seeing the importance of what George Soros called Heisenberg's principle, which is that in the process of observing our environment, we are changing it. We are changing our conceptual structure, we are changing our manipulations of it, and so forth. And that introduces uncertainty. And seeing our human condition in those terms and our economic decisions in those terms is what this work is all about.
Perhaps also just adding to your question, so we also study both sides. We also study psychopaths, we study narcissistic, we study all these cases. I would say if you look at the percentages of really evil people or really super altruists, this is kind of neglected. But so if you would just go for majority, most of us human beings have all these different potential in us. So we can be good and bad, and we can change in seconds. Like the experiment I showed you where you can turn into the lab someone from an empathic response into Schadenfreude just by telling this is an in-group or out-group member. And that's what, other behavioral economists have called conditional cooperator. And we are mostly conditional cooperator. We start defecting if we are, faced with too many free riders, but typically we are conditionally cooperating if the conditions are met. So I think to answer also Dennis, and also of course we also come from problem solving. So the problem we want to solve is how to get people educated to global citizen. How can we move from in-group compassion to global compassion? How can we actually get us as a whole civilization to understand that we can't just think in nation anymore, a little tribe structure, but that we have to have a responsibility, which is felt responsibility for a global cooperation. And I think this is a real economic problem. And that's like on the basis of nearly all the big economic problem I've seen so far, not being economist. So if we can tackle this is, I think, the root of problem solving. But it's not an easy thing. And so we are looking at what are the contextual conditions of moving us in a culture evolution one step so that we can become global cooperator. And for that we need to understand in-group, out-group distinction, how motivational systems fight to each other, how the context is actually priming, global cooperation rather than fear or threat. And I think as long as we have not modeled that and not understood that, we can't really move towards that. And the third point is that I have a firm belief that changing narrative is the biggest problem solver. If we start because we are so much reflective creature, if we believe that we are egoistic people and that we can't do better, we will create an egoistic society. If we believe that we are altruistic and we have experiments to that, people start cooperating more just because they believe that they can do that. They believe on plasticity as a possibility and they become plastic. And because we have this, it's very, very important to actually change the narrative first, and then, problems will solve much easier from itself. So I completely agree. Of course, it should be about problems, and perhaps, we should move in starting more to use a specific problem and then to apply these models to a specific problem. Perhaps that would make you, feeling more, we're moving to really solving problems and not just deconstructing something.
I just think that if you solve some problems, if you get some good solutions, you won't have to worry about your authority.
Yeah, and I think this is really what or at least, this is my main motivation to do research.
I think unfortunately, most of the new economic thinking is on the surface negative. When you think of the fact that you have to recognize imperfect understanding, that's a very negative idea. And and we do have a communication problem, because everything that sounds negative also has a positive side. So the fact that our understanding is imperfect, it means that the scope for improving our understanding is actually infinite. And that is really the message we have to deliver by actually exploring, instead of asking about what is scientific and what is not, especially when you have a concept of science that was originally based on Newtonian physics as the ideal of having eternally valid generalizations explaining and predicting events. That's possible about billiard balls. It's not possible about human events. So that's exactly that. There are also a whole range of problems that have been buried by Lionel Robbins forever, have now reappeared, and you have mentioned some. Just to mention one. All the non-negotiable values that are part of your identity are totally disregarded in economic theory. So that's, and if you attended some other subjects, like for instance, we had a session in the morning about the euro crisis. So I think we are discovering and dealing with these problems. That's what makes new economic thinking so exciting.
So I'm faced with the enviable task of tying up and unraveling. Antonio, you said something very powerful. Nothing is fixed. But then the scope of possibility associated with that is increased. But I remind you, as I run this organization, I have to figure out how to evolve economics. And what bothers me is that there are many experiments where people who are trained as economists prove less capable of getting to a cooperative outcome in a game than people who are not trained in economics. As a result, there is a cultural heritage that we start with here at INET, and it makes me rethink my strategy. I'm looking at this entire audience, this whole group, as an affiliation training, with your teachers being right here for today's lesson. But maybe in the future, I have to invite fewer economists and surround them with other people who are more amenable to change in order to change those few economists, rather than trying to form a culture among economists. These things are haunting me. And whenever I'm haunted, I retreat to music. And I'll finish tonight with a little bit of lyrics. Many of you see the film Searching for Sugar Man, which was the Academy Award Best Documentary a couple years ago, about a man named Rodriguez from my hometown of Detroit, whose career was resurrected later in life. And he wrote something: as our ship pulls away from the sea, I hear this music behind me, pulls away from the orthodox economics. And it goes like this: and you claim you got something going, something you call unique. But I've seen your self-pity showing and the tears that roll down your cheek. Soon you'll know I'll leave you, and I'll never look behind, 'cause I was born for this here purpose, to crucify your mind. Thank you very much.